Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Respect podcast. I'm Kim Scott.
And I'm Wesley Faulkner. I am so excited for this show. One of my most favorite people who I've read and tracked in a good way over the years is on the show today.
I am thrilled to have with us today Susan Fowler Rigetti. Susan is a novelist, journalist, screenwriter, and the author of 3 books. In 2017, Susan's blog post about her experiences as a software engineer at Uber sent shockwaves through the industry. She went on to write a critically acclaimed memoir called Whistleblower. She is also the author of a novel, Cover Story. She has written for the New York Times, Time Magazine, Slate, Vanity Fair, and has been an editor at PhilPapers for nearly a decade. Welcome, Susan.
Hi, I am Susan Rigetti. I am so excited to be chatting with you both.
So, like a lot of people, Susan, I first came across you when you wrote your blog post about your experiences
Yes.
at Uber, and I had this overwhelming sense, like, oh my gosh, I have been a coward my whole life because I kept dodging all these fights that all the stuff that had happened to me, and I think in no small part I wrote Radical Respect thanks to that moment of realizing, if Susan can do it, I can do it. So
Wow.
thank you for that.
Also, I have to say that I um, read your blog post and your story when I was going through some hard times at my job. And so it brought me comfort to read that. And when I reached out to you, you were kind enough to respond. And so I was actually looking at our DMs on X, it was Twitter at the time, and just reminded of how sweet and caring and nurturing a person you are. So thank you for that as well.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Thank you, Wesley.
You never know what impact you're going to have on folks. So Wesley, you and I were chatting before we got on about some excellent questions you had on Whistleblower. So why don't you jump into that book?
So Whistleblower is kind of the whole precursor for the blog post you wrote about your interesting time at Uber.
It's
And
the post cursor, right? It came
post
after.
cursor, yeah.
Yes.
Well, there's a lot of like your background and stuff into it,
Yes.
so to really to explain about how challenging your life was and how much you worked to get to where you were, and how much agency you try to wield, but still powers that be seem to be against you on a lot of different turns.
Yeah.
And in the book, you repeatedly talked about how during a hardship like ASU, then Penn, and how you learned from each one and kind of modified from reflecting on ways that or things you could have thought of and done beforehand. And then we get all the way up to Uber, where you decide to write your blog post, and and from hindsight now, what are the things that when you reflect on writing the blog post and even the book that you have learned and the advice you would have given yourself back then?
I think about this like probably way more often than I should. Because when I look back at, so basically I was so young. I was 25, working at Uber, and I found myself in this position where like all these terrible things were happening. They had this really discriminatory, awful culture. And I was just, I had this feeling of I've come this far and worked so hard. And I thought things would be better, but it's the same. Like it's the
Yeah.
same sort of mistreatment. What's going on here? And I think, at that point, I had been quiet for so long, and growing up growing up in poverty, seeing the ways that there were these systemic things that kind of kept me and my family in poverty, kept the people around me in poverty, trying to break out of that, then getting into college and seeing that there were also things there, administrative, bureaucratic things that kept people kind of in their place. and saying like, oh my gosh, I have to break out of that. I don't know how. In that, instead of doing anything, I just kind of ran away from that problem and thinking it would be better. Okay, I just have to get to this next place, get to this better place, get to this like more enlightened place. And it was the same stuff. It was just like more entrenched, systemic mistreatment of people. And I was like, wait a second, this is enough. And the thing that was so frustrating was I felt like no one inside the company was listening, right? Like no one in power was listening. And it's not surprising, right? They were the ones who had built up and benefited from all these barriers that they put in place and all these different things that they did, like all their different HR policies to like cover up mistreatment to protect people that they considered high performers, which is just so absurd. And then I just had enough. And so looking back, it's like, I really do think, if I could look at my younger self and just say like, this is how it is. You can't necessarily break it or see how to break it from the inside. You have to step out. And you also can't succeed in corrupt systems. Like there are so many times when I look back at things that I'm like, I was trying to figure out, how do I succeed in this place where the culture is just totally broken? You can't succeed in a place that rewards misbehavior and rewards the wrong things, right?
Yeah.
And so my biggest advice to myself would be get out. Get out.
Which you did. I mean, you did get out.
I
did. Don't forget to quit. That was some of the best career advice
Yes.
that anybody ever gave me.
And then also, not being afraid to say what's going on.
Yeah.
Right? Is because up until that point when I was at Uber, when something happened, like I would raise my concerns for a while, but then when people weren't listening or didn't seem to care, or I would get, negative consequences for it, I would just not say anything. I would just kind of shut up and move on quietly. And this time I was like, no more of that, right?
Yeah.
Like that
Yeah.
wasn't, I had kind of gotten to the point where it was so absurd that I didn't care about the consequences. I was like, okay, fine. What are you going to do to me that you already haven't done? And that's the benefit of youth, right? Is that I was young enough that like, I didn't have kids at the time, didn't have a mortgage, didn't have all these things where it was like, okay, I can burn my life down and it won't hurt me. And that was also another thing. Sorry, I could just go on forever.
No,
please do. Yes.
Is that not everyone can do that, right?
Yeah.
Because looking at so many of my colleagues, I would talk to them and I would say, what's going on? Why aren't you saying anything? Why aren't you doing anything? They'd be like, well, I'm on a work visa. If I speak up, I get fired. I have to leave. What's going to happen to my family? What's going to happen to this life we're building? And those kinds of things are the things that keep people in situations that are terrible for them because they can't say anything. And, in the years since, I've talked to, oh my gosh, probably thousands of people at this point who find themselves in really sticky situations where they're being mistreated, they're being discriminated against, they're dealing with harassment, retaliation. And then they have a list of like, here's the reasons why I can't say anything. Yeah. And to me, that's like one of the most important things for people who can speak up, like me in that situation, is like, okay, if you have nothing to lose, or if you can make a list of the things you can lose and be okay with it, then I do think there is kind of that responsibility, because there are a lot of people who would speak up, but they can't, right? It would come at such an intense cost to their family.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I think, though, that you did have what to lose, and you also had what to gain. I think part of as I look back at my career, as I sort of looked myself in the mirror after I read your blog post, and I thought, why didn't I speak up in some of these other situations that I had been in? And I also didn't have much to lose, but there was also a lot I had a lot of unvested stock options, and
yeah.
I mean, I feel kind of ashamed to admit that I allowed money to silence me. But if I'm honest, that was a big part of why I was silent. It's like, if I can just suck it up and deal with this for another few years, then I can go write my novels, which we'll talk about in a minute.
That's really common. And I think it makes like places like Silicon Valley, where historically that's been like one of the biggest that's like the way that you get paid, right? It's like you'll get like a good salary, but then you'll get a giant pile of stock options
Yeah.
that when you think about the value, you're like, okay, if I just tough it out, if I just stick through it,
Yeah.
then it'll be worth it, and then I can do whatever. And I've heard that from a lot of people where they say like, well, I didn't say anything because I knew if I stuck around for another 2 years, who cares if they treat me poorly, if that at the end of that I have enough money. And it's
It's a hedonic treadmill.
it
You gotta
is
you
it
gotta
is
Yeah.
be sure that you
Yeah.
know when you're gonna get off that thing.
And
Mhm.
I also think that, like, when you think about also what there is to gain, one of the things that I look at when I look at like things that I regret in my life and then things I'm proud of is like anytime that I did something that I felt was like true to my character, true to who
Mhm.
I want to be and who I aspire to be. Those things are sometimes the most uncomfortable things, they're the most painful things. But then I look back and I'm like, wow, am I ever glad I did that? Like,
Yeah.
I'm so glad that I took that step. It came at such a huge cost in all these other ways, but I can look back and say, wow, I am so glad I did that. Like, I'm proud of myself. And you can't, like, stock options can't buy. I know it sounds so trite, but like, really, they can't buy you that ability to look at yourself and be like, okay.
I am me. Like, there's not enough money in the world that is worth trading that off. Or
Yeah.
I have agency, like, to help.
Also, the other thing I think about, speaking of money, is like, I would honestly pay to not be treated that way,
Yeah.
right? Think of like
Yes.
how awful it is to endure that kind of mistreatment. And you
Yeah.
think, I would give anything. I would give anything to not be treated that way. And
Yes.
you can put that price on your stock options. If
Yeah.
anybody listening is in this situation, think about how much money you would pay to not be
Yes, not to
right.
be yeah, not to be disrespected, no
Yeah.
Yeah. And
continually.
also they say that, when you on your deathbed, the things that you might be thinking about are the regrets.
Yeah.
And carrying that for so long is takes a toll, and that has a price as well.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
bet if you like fast forward 50, 30, 60 years, depending on how long your lifespan is, you probably would have paid like 3, 4 times as much as those stock options or grants, just so you don't have to live with
Absolutely.
that thought.
And that was something that was like very the non-monetary cost, like the emotional and psychological cost
Yeah.
that kind of thing takes on people. Like, I know I struggled with such severe depression when I was at Uber. And I
Yeah.
know that so many of my colleagues, like I had a colleague who committed suicide.
Mm.
I had colleagues who attempted suicide. Like, sorry to bring this up, but like that's
Yeah.
the kind of cost that comes with these cultures that are, that treat people in these ways, that have, so much discrimination and harassment and then retaliation and covering up when that stuff happens to you. Like, that takes a toll. Like, I remember I would sit in these meetings and they would tell you that, like, they'd tell me that like the thing that I was experiencing wasn't real, right?
Yeah,
And, like,
yeah,
you can
that kind
only
of
hear that so much
gaslighting.
before you're like, what is wrong with me? Am I making this up? Am I losing my mind? And
Yes.
then that, like, it's awful. And people often don't think about those kinds of costs, right? Like, we can put like, okay, there's like the loss of a job, there's like loss of career, there's also just like loss of yourself,
Yeah.
right? And I
Yeah.
felt that a lot, of just like losing who I was. And I remember so clearly, I felt like I was totally losing touch with like who I actually was as a person. And I started to like every day like make this list of like, who do I want to be. Ben Franklin used to do this. He'd make a list of like, am I kind, was I just, was I honest. And I would like make a list and be like, okay, because that was the person I wanted to be. And it was so not the culture that was being, on the ground at this company. And I felt like I was losing myself, like who I was
Yes.
and what I cared about, my values. And so I started doing that. And then it gave me so much courage, because then I'd be like, okay, no, I'm not making this up. This HR lady is telling me that this has not happened. But no, here, I have documents. Here, look at this. This is true. And like giving me courage to be myself and to be honest about those things. And like, I don't know, I just feel like that was that was something that I'm glad that I fought for, like fighting for yourself, you know?
Thrilled you fought for, and you know what? You got rewarded for fighting for it as well, I think.
Yeah.
Not only with yourself, but you got a book, you got a movie, you got some pretty big,
Didn't get the movie. The movie didn't happen, but
I'm optimistic. The movie's gonna happen.
But it was funny because, I didn't want to do anything around it because I was so much like, okay, I've said my thing. I've,
You wanna move on.
I
Yeah.
wrote the blog post. I'm done. I've said what I have to say. I didn't do interviews. I didn't do any interviews until like 10 months after.
Mhm.
Because I didn't want anyone to look at me and say, oh, she just did it to be famous, or oh,
Yeah.
she just
Right.
did it to
Yeah.
get attention, or she just wanted to be on TV or any of this stuff.
Yeah.
And then I decided to do the book because people had all these stories about me that they had about who I was and where I came from and why I did it. And I heard people saying these stories back to me, and they would say them in the news, and I'd hear it from reporters. I was like, no, none of this is who I am. None of this
Yeah.
is real. You have no idea who I am. You have no idea where I came from. You have no idea why I did this.
Yeah.
And so I said, okay, I'm going to write a book and I'm going to set the record straight about who I am. And a lot of places and people only wanted to hear the Uber stuff. And I
Yeah.
said, no, no, no. It starts so much far, like you have to go back. Because if you
Yeah.
just look at this, it's just like, oh, this woman without any context decided to do this thing. It was brave. Yay. We all
Yeah.
cheer. When the reality is like, I came from a very strange background and I had fought so hard and I had learned so many lessons because this wasn't the first time. And I
Yeah.
knew what to do because I'd been through this before and I hadn't done
Yeah.
that. Right? Like
Yes.
I had learned all those lessons. And then when it happened at Uber, I was ready. Like I knew how to document everything.
Yeah.
I knew how to find out what the law was. I
Yeah.
knew how to I knew what to do, but that was only because it wasn't like I was just like some perfect person who knew what to do just from nowhere. Like, no,
Yeah.
I had practiced in really terrible situations before.
Yeah.
And that's why I knew. And so that's what I wanted to give people is just be like, here,
Here's
this
the
is how
playbook.
I learned, right?
Yeah.
Read where I came from so that you can see how I got to this point. And to me, that I hope is helpful to people because that's the only way I can explain it. Because then when people say, well, how did you know what to do? It's like, well,
Mm.
this thing happened when I was younger, and this thing
Yeah.
happened, and this thing happened. And from each one of those, I learned these different pieces that otherwise I wouldn't have known how to do.
One of the things about the book, you talk about your journey and how much you had to like teach yourself even when your mom had to go to work and
Yeah.
you had to find your own way. But one of the other things is like, unfortunately, some of your coworkers didn't make it because of the mental stress,
Yeah.
but you found outlets. You found ways to kind of supplant that. That gaslighting, the assault on you at work by finding your own way of soothing yourself with friends and with Chad, but also with writing. One of the questions that I had that I was hoping to get an answer to is that you alluded that you're writing a sci-fi novel, but I
Yes.
haven't seen it. Is it coming out? What is it about? What can you share about it?
So it's written. I just have to find someone to publish it.
Fiction is so hard. Well, I would love to read it. Wesley and I will be your readers.
Okay, I'll send it to you. I'll
Send
send it
it.
to you,
Yes.
and then you can tell me what you think. But I've learned, growing up and writing, and then now, like, making my living as a writer, I always thought until I actually became a writer that, oh, writing is the hard part. But then you realize, no, it's everything else around the writing that's the hard part, right? Like, you can have this ideal thing, this book, this story, you can finish it, but like you gotta have it marketed, and you gotta find the right publisher, and you gotta find the right everything, and it all has to come together. And a lot of the times it doesn't. So you just gotta stick to it and just keep going.
Yeah, I have 3 novels, and a stack of rejection letters for my 3 novels. It's writing fiction is really
It's
hard,
hard, right?
even yeah, yeah. But you did get Cover Story, right? Cover
Yes.
Story is great.
Oh,
I
thank
love Cover
you.
Story.
Oh, thank you. I had so much fun writing that one. I had a blast.
So
I was
Wesley
I
was
was just talking about it.
Go ahead. Wesley, confess how
I
you
was
felt.
the ending, the twist. Really, I won't spoil it, but it's just like, oh, it left me with a sense of. I'll just say I was a
She
little bit
got you.
angry.
She got you.
I was,
She got
yes.
you.
I'm
I was
sorry.
like, I was rooting for you. But yeah, it was good in that you definitely elicited a lot of emotion throughout, but very strong at the end of the novel.
That was one of the reasons it was so much fun to write, because like there were like two narratives that are being told, right? The one that you want the reader to create in their head, and then the one that they'll go back and read and just be like, wait a second. Now I see what's happening.
And
it was really fun.
I think that's part of what happened. I mean, I think it's part of our system, because our system is telling us that, you just do good work and you'll get
Yeah.
rewarded. And of course, that's a bunch of BS.
Yeah, exactly. It is. It's all lies. That's never true anywhere.
I mean, sometimes it's true some places, but that is not by and large. The system rewards, those born on third base, full stop.
Yeah.
But the sad part is also the people who are born on third base believe it, and it's a lie.
Yeah.
And they'll perpetuate the lie, but also they will blame other people when they don't see them succeeding, or if it's just, just apply for a job, you'll get one.
Yeah,
or just
it's not so easy. Yeah,
they really don't understand about what the real and true problems are, and the holes in the system, which means that the people who have some of this privilege, some of the most power, are not incentivized to fix it.
Yeah,
because
of
they
course,
don't
because
feel
they're
that it
benefiting
exists.
from it, right? Even if they don't realize it. And
Yes.
also, I think that a lot of people in that situation are in denial, right? Because like no one wants to admit to themselves, well, I actually, got here because of specific things that I didn't really earn or didn't work for. And no one wants to undermine their own success, right? And
Yes.
that reminds me of something that I do think about, like when I'm in situations that are kind of dire or intense, which is like, okay, what are the barriers here? Like, what are the things that I don't see that are making this situation tough for me or tough for others, right? So that's another thing, is that I often do, especially since the Uber blog post, like people come to me and they ask for advice, and I try as much as I can to help them. Sometimes I'm stumped because I'm like, I don't know. And then so I have to think like, okay, what are the barriers here? What are the things that are keeping the systemic things that are keeping this person in this position where they are being treated this way, or where they can't improve their life, or where they don't know what to do and they're stuck? And there are so many things. And I feel like being able to see as much as you can and keep your eyes open to what are the things that are keeping us in these places, and what are the things that are keeping us in, places of, where we can't get ahead, where we are being stuck. It's just like, it's all systemic, right?
Yes.
It's never individual stuff.
Yeah. And I think that was one of the things when I very first met you. Do you remember you came to my house?
Yes.
We had lunch. And I asked you, I said, and I think for folks out there who want to figure out how to speak truth to power without blowing up their careers, you gave such good advice. I said, why did you keep reporting to HR when you knew that they weren't going to help you? And you were like, that was the whole point. So explain to folks what you explained to me, because that was how you identified what the systemic barriers were to you succeeding in this situation.
So basically, you can't, so like, to put this simply, if you do not report to HR things that are happening, then you cannot legally hold them accountable, right? So a lot of people will say, and you hear this all the time, is like, well, why would you go to HR? They're not your friend. Doesn't matter. Because if you need to keep a record of you reporting things to them and them not following through, and then you can actually have legal standing to go and do something about it. Otherwise, there's no record, right? If you're not reporting stuff, because you legally have to give them the chance to fix something and alert them to it. Otherwise, they can't be held accountable. And so I feel like that's the most important thing that you can do, is understand these are the rules of this, whatever structure I'm in, whatever bureaucracy that I'm in, here are the rules I have to follow to get, like, just to even to hold them accountable. There are these rules,
Yeah.
like with the HR thing. And I reported things to HR so often and always be told the same thing. Oh, this is their first offense. Oh, blah, blah, blah. This never happened before. And I was just like, okay, keep saying it. Keep
Just
saying it.
keep,
Because it
yeah.
clearly isn't the first time, because I've already reported it like a million times before. And that's ultimately what helped me. But I had learned that from when I was
Yes.
at Penn. I
Yeah.
had learned that from when I was at Penn, and when they were telling me all these things, and I was calling lawyers and saying, what do I do? And, oh, here's how you document things. Here's how
Yeah.
here's how you find out what law applies to, which employment laws apply to you. And yeah, I think that's the critical thing, right? Is like,
Yeah.
and it comes back to something as simple as just like, know what your legal rights are, right?
Yes. Yes.
And just figure out.
Yeah, and I think that, so two other important things for folks. One is, like you've said a bunch, documentation. And
Yeah.
like for you and me, we love to write. Wesley has
Yeah.
told me several times he doesn't love to write. Like, so
Yes.
for folks who don't love to write, what's a good way to document because you did an excellent job keeping the receipts. So how do you keep the receipts?
Screenshot everything.
Yes.
Screenshot
Take a picture.
everything. Because even when I get tired of documenting stuff, I've got a pile of screenshots. And honestly, those screenshots are really what come in handy the most, because it's like you can't argue with something. So what I learned over the years is like, and this is what I tell everyone, is like, if somebody sends you something that's very not okay in some way, or you've got something going on in the back of your head that's like, this isn't right, screenshot it. If they say something in person and you're like, wait a second, did they really just say that? What do I do? How do I avoid this becoming a he said, she said thing? You sit down, you write an email, you say, hey, just to clarify, we just had a conversation. You said this. Give them a chance to say whatever they want to say. They might say, I never said that. Whatever. But document whatever they said. And then the other thing is, like, if you have a company email, and people are going to hate me for this at all the IT organizations, don't ever log into it on your personal computer, but definitely forward all that documentation, all those screenshots, all those emails to your personal email.
Yes.
Do it, because you're going to need it, because they're going to shut off your company work email and your chat access, and you're going to have nothing to do. So that's really it. It's just like, document, put things in writing. You can take notes. Notes are evidence. If you have a weird meeting, just jot down or screenshot or send them an email. And it's like one of those things, and that's what you got.
Right.
Those are great tips. And I wish we could talk forever, but I know we're short on time, and we have to let you go. But one of the things in your book is that you mentioned your dad and your mom as really great examples. And you also talk at the beginning of the book about that your daughter, hopefully she comes into a world that she doesn't recognize. And so if you're looking for ideas for your next book, I would love for you to be able to distill your knowledge and how, now being a mother for this amount of time, how much what you're passing on to the next generation to try to change the world. But thank you so much for being on the show. And we really, really appreciate you spending the time with us.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful. And you know what? I'll come on again if you ever want.
We would love it. Yes, let's keep talking. I love this conversation. Thank you so much,
Thank you
Susan.
so much, Wesley and Kim. It's so good to see you.
Great to see you.
Thank
Take
you.
care, everybody, and we'll see you next week.